It was an oppressively humid morning in August when Elijah Carter stepped out of his truck onto the bustling parking lot of Rivermill Police Department, nestled deep in the wooded hills of Vermont. Clad in a worn flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots, he was far from the image of a man who had spent decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. This was deliberate. Elijah had been appointed chief of police just days ago, but he hadn't announced his arrival to the officers. He believed in seeing the truth, the raw, unvarnished reality of the precinct's culture. As he adjusted his weathered cap, Elijah surveyed the scene. Officers laughed and shared stories near their patrol cars, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. He exhaled deeply, shouldering the weight of his mission, to cleanse this department of the whispers of misconduct and restore its integrity. A black man taking charge in a predominantly white traditional precinct was bound to provoke resistance, but Elijah welcomed the challenge. Entering through a side door, Elijah was greeted by the clamor of ringing phones and the aroma of stale coffee. He moved deliberately, noting the camaraderie among officers and the hierarchy that silently dictated their interactions. His unassuming presence went largely unnoticed until a sharp voice pierced the air. "Hey, you, what are you doing here?" barked a tall officer with a sneer. His badge read Officer Matthews. A few others nearby paused their chatter, eyes gleaming with interest. Elijah turned slowly to face Matthews. "Excuse me?" "This ain't a shelter," Matthews jeered, his tone laced with disdain. "Take your trash and go." Before Elijah could respond, Matthews stepped closer, his voice louder. "You deaf? I said get out." The words hit Elijah like a slap, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. Then, to his shock, Matthews spat in his face. Laughter erupted from the bystanders. Elijah felt the warm spit drip down his cheek, but he moved calmly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. As he wiped his face, his voice, though soft, cut through the noise like steel. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Matthews smirked, shrugging. "Just the ones who don't belong." Elijah said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, his heartbeat pounding with fury and purpose. It was time for the briefing. The moment these officers would realize the man they mocked was about to lead them. And Elijah was ready to deliver a message none of them would ever forget. The briefing room was alive with chatter as officers filed in, coffee mugs in hand, swapping jokes and casual remarks. The energy was carefree, the usual rhythm of a team that felt untouchable within its walls. Officer Matthews leaned casually against the wall, his smug grin a reminder of the morning's humiliating encounter. His audience, still buzzing with laughter from earlier, huddled around him, sharing whispered jabs. Unseen by most, Elijah Carter entered through a side door, a folder with the precinct's official seal tucked under his arm. He paused just inside, scanning the faces of the gathered officers. Some were familiar from personnel files he'd studied. Others were strangers whose reputations had preceded them. He stepped forward slowly, his boots striking the polished floor in deliberate rhythm. His presence unnoticed until Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with a commanding voice, called the room to order. "All right, settle down, everyone." Harris's voice silenced the chatter, and the officers turned their attention to the front. "We've got an important introduction today. As most of you know, Chief Morgan retired last month, and it's time to welcome his replacement." The room shifted, murmurs spreading like a ripple. Matthews chuckled under his breath, leaning to whisper something to the officer beside him. Harris cleared his throat, his expression serious. "It's my honor to introduce a man with a stellar record, a visionary who will be leading this department forward. Please welcome our new Chief of Police, Elijah Carter." The room froze as Elijah stepped into view, his calm, steady stride bringing him to the podium. The weight of his presence was immediate, palpable. The folder landed on the lectern with a soft thud, and Elijah scanned the room, letting the tension simmer. Matthew's smirk vanished, his face draining of color as realization hit him like a freight train. His eyes widened, darting nervously toward his colleagues, whose whispers swelled to murmurs of disbelief. "Good morning," Elijah began, his voice steady and composed. "My name is Elijah Carter. As of today, I am your chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Elijah let it linger, his gaze meeting every officer in the room. When his eyes finally settled on Matthews, the man looked down, his confidence from earlier crumbling under the weight of shame. "I arrived here this morning in plain clothes," Elijah continued, "because I wanted to see this department for what it truly is, not the polished version prepared for an inspection, but the reality of its culture. What I witnessed was—" He paused, his voice hardening. "Disappointing." A wave of discomfort swept through the room. Elijah's words were like a mirror, forcing the officers to confront the ugliness they'd allowed to thrive. He raised a hand to silence the low murmur of voices. "Respect is not optional," he said firmly. "It is the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just ourselves, but the community we are sworn to protect." Elijah's gaze returned to Matthews, whose discomfort was now painfully evident. "This morning," Elijah continued, his voice sharp, "some of you laughed as a man was humiliated and disrespected. You thought it was a moment of power, of control. But let me make one thing clear. That behavior ends today." The room was motionless, the officers stunned by his directness. Elijah leaned slightly forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity, whether they wear a badge or not. And if you can't uphold that standard, then you have no place here." He turned to Captain Harris. "Effective immediately, Officer Matthews is suspended pending an internal investigation." Gasps rippled through the room. Matthews' face turned crimson and he stammered, "Chief?" "You didn't think," Elijah interrupted coldly, "and that is the problem." Elijah's gaze swept the room one final time. "For those of you ready to do better, to be better, we move forward together. But let me make this clear. There will be no tolerance for misconduct, disrespect, or prejudice. Not on my watch." With that, Elijah stepped back from the podium, leaving the room to absorb the full weight of his words. As the officers filed out in heavy silence, the gravity of his leadership settled over them like a storm cloud. Elijah had taken his first step toward dismantling a culture steeped in complacency, and he had no intention of turning back. The precinct's corridors buzzed with uneasy energy after Elijah Carter's speech. Officers avoided eye contact, their usual camaraderie muted by the weight of his words. Whispers filled the air, some defensive, others contemplative. Officer Matthews sat alone in a corner of the locker room, his face a blend of anger and humiliation. The suspension notice in his hand felt heavier than paper, a symbol of the precarious foundation that had long supported his unchecked behavior. Elijah, now in his office, stared out the window overlooking the parking lot. The precinct below seemed deceptively peaceful, but he knew better. Years of misconduct had eroded trust within the department and the community it served. Changing that culture would take more than speeches. It would take action, consistency, and the courage to face the pushback he knew was coming. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. Captain Harris stepped in, a stack of files in his hand. "Chief," he said, setting them down on Elijah's desk. "As requested, here's everything on Matthews. Complaints, incident reports, the works." Elijah sat down, flipping through the files. The list of infractions was damning. Multiple accusations of excessive force, inappropriate comments, and discriminatory behavior, all brushed under the rug with weak warnings or outright dismissals. He looked up at Harris, his expression hard. "How did this go unnoticed for so long?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but pointed. Harris hesitated, then sighed. "It didn't, but Matthews has connections. His uncle's a retired captain, his father a city councilman. Every time someone tried to hold him accountable, it got buried." Elijah leaned back, the weight of systemic rot settling on his shoulders. "Not anymore," he said firmly. "This stops here." Meanwhile, in the precinct's break room, Officer Maria Reyes, one of the department's newer recruits, sat quietly, her coffee untouched. She had seen what happened that morning. Matthew's cruelty, the laughter of her colleagues, the humiliation that Chief Carter endured. Guilt gnawed at her. She had stayed silent, just like everyone else, too afraid to speak out. "Maria, you good?" Officer Jordan, an older, kinder face in the precinct, sat down beside her. Maria hesitated, then nodded. "Just thinking about the chief's speech," she said softly. "Do you think he means it? About changing things?" Jordan sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I think he does. Question is, are we ready for it?" Maria swallowed hard. "I want to be," she said. "I'm tired of pretending like everything's fine when it's not." Jordan gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Then don't pretend. Speak up. You're not alone." Back in his office, Elijah crafted a plan. He needed more than words to dismantle the toxic culture within the precinct. He needed allies, officers willing to challenge the status quo and rebuild trust with the community. He picked up the phone and called the department's liaison for community outreach. "Sergeant Patel," he began, "I want to set up a series of town halls, open forums where residents can share their concerns directly with us." Patel hesitated. "Chief, you sure about that? These meetings can get heated." "That's exactly why we need them," Elijah replied. "If we're serious about change, we need to listen, even when it's uncomfortable." As he hung up, another knock came at his door. This time, it was Maria Reyes. She stood nervously, her hands clasped tightly together. "Chief," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to speak with you." Elijah motioned for her to sit. "What's on your mind, Officer Reyes?" Maria took a deep breath. "This morning, I saw what happened with Matthews, and I didn't do anything. I should have, but I didn't. I'm sorry." Elijah studied her for a moment before speaking. "It takes courage to admit that, Officer Reyes. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" "I want to be better," she said, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "I want to help change things." Elijah nodded. "Then start by holding yourself and your peers accountable. Change doesn't come from one person. It takes all of us." Maria left his office with a newfound resolve. For the first time, she felt like her voice mattered. And Elijah, watching her go, felt the faintest crack in the precinct's hardened foundation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The town hall meeting was scheduled for a chilly Thursday evening in River Mills Community Center, a modest space with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. Word had spread quickly after the announcement, and by the time Elijah Carter arrived, the room was packed. Residents of every background filled the seats, their faces a mix of skepticism, frustration, and tentative hope. Elijah stood at the back for a moment, observing. This was the community he had sworn to serve and protect, wounded but still yearning for trust. At exactly 6 p.m., Elijah stepped to the front, adjusting the microphone. The room hushed, the weight of anticipation settling over the crowd. His voice, steady and calm, carried through the room. "Good evening. My name is Elijah Carter, and as of this month, I am your chief of police." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I called this meeting because I believe that for any real change to happen, we need to start here, with you." Murmurs rippled through the audience. An older man in the front row crossed his arms, his expression guarded. A young woman near the back whispered something to her neighbor, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Elijah pressed on. "I know trust has been broken," he continued. "I've read the complaints, I've seen the videos, I've heard the stories, and I won't stand here and make excuses for what's happened in the past. What I will do is promise this. Under my leadership, accountability and respect will not be negotiable." A hand shot up near the front. "Promises don't mean anything," said the speaker, a middle-aged woman with a weary look. "We've heard it all before. What makes you any different?" Elijah met her gaze without flinching. "You're right to question me," he said. "I'm not here to tell you to trust me overnight. I'm here to earn it, step by step, action by action. And that starts with listening. Tonight, I want to hear from you. What are your concerns? Your fears? Your expectations?" The room was silent for a beat. Then a man in the back stood up. His voice trembled with anger. "My son was stopped 3 times in 1 month last year for no reason. He's 16. You call that protecting the community?" Elijah nodded, his expression serious. "No, I don't. That's profiling, and it's unacceptable. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you after this to discuss your son's case further. I'll personally look into it." The man hesitated, surprised by the directness of Elijah's response before nodding. Slowly, more voices joined in. One by one, residents stood to speak, each story a piece of a larger, painful mosaic. Elijah listened intently, scribbling notes, his unwavering attention a stark contrast to the dismissive attitudes many had encountered before. Back at the precinct the next morning, the atmosphere was markedly different. Word of the town hall had spread, and officers spoke in hushed tones about the chief's unorthodox approach. Some were uneasy, others quietly impressed. Elijah convened a meeting in the briefing room, the same space where he had delivered his first stern address. "Last night I heard from our community," Elijah began, his tone firm but not accusatory. "And the message was clear. They don't trust us. And we're the ones who let that happen." He looked around the room, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Change starts with us. Effective immediately. We're implementing new training on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. This isn't optional. If you're not willing to learn and grow, this isn't the department for you." The room was silent, the officers absorbing the announcement. Maria Reyes sat straighter, a flicker of determination in her eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, their skepticism apparent. Elijah continued, "This isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about rebuilding trust. When you put on that badge, you represent more than yourself. You represent justice. And justice isn't a privilege, it's a right." In the following weeks, small but significant changes began to ripple through the department. Officers attended workshops and were paired with community mentors who shared their perspectives. Maria Reyes emerged as a vocal advocate, encouraging her peers to embrace the training. Even Captain Harris, initially skeptical, began to see the value in the new direction. But not everyone welcomed the change. Matthews, still suspended, appealed his case through union channels, claiming he was being targeted unfairly. Elijah stood firm, his investigation uncovering a history of complaints that painted a clear picture of a pattern unworthy of the badge. One evening, as Elijah walked through the precinct's halls, he was stopped by Maria. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you for listening, for making me feel like I can speak up." Elijah gave her a small smile. "Thank you, Officer Reyes. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because of people like you willing to stand up for what's right." As he returned to his office, Elijah felt a cautious optimism. The cracks in the foundation were beginning to heal, the first sparks of transformation catching fire. It was only the beginning, but for the first time, he felt that Rivermill's future could be brighter. Change was never easy, and Elijah Carter knew the resistance would come. Weeks into his tenure as chief of police, the pushback began in earnest. Rumors swirled through the precinct halls, whispers of discontent among officers who felt the new policies were an attack on their autonomy. Some called the changes unnecessary, while others outright dismissed them as political grandstanding. The loudest opposition came from Officer Matthews. Despite his suspension and mounting evidence against him, he painted himself as a victim. "The chief's just here to make examples out of people," Matthews grumbled to a small group in a corner of the locker room. "He doesn't care about us, only his image." Elijah was well aware of the murmurs. He made no effort to silence them, believing in the power of transparency. "Let them talk," he told Captain Harris one morning. "Change doesn't happen without friction." Tensions reached a boiling point during a department-wide training on implicit bias. Some officers engaged earnestly, while others, like Matthew's allies, sat with arms crossed, refusing to participate. Midway through the session, one officer, Sergeant Cole, stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," Cole said, his voice cutting through the room. "We're being treated like criminals for doing our jobs." Elijah, seated quietly at the back, rose and walked to the front. The room stilled. "Sergeant Cole," Elijah began, his tone calm but firm, "if doing your job means ignoring the humanity of the people you serve, then yes, this training is necessary." Cole opened his mouth to argue, but Elijah held up a hand. "This isn't about shaming anyone. It's about growth. If you're unwilling to grow, this department may not be the right place for you." The room was silent. Cole sat back down, his defiance tempered by Elijah's unyielding presence. Later that week, Elijah met with Maria Reyes and a handful of officers who had embraced the new direction. Together, they brainstormed ways to foster collaboration between the department and the community, from outreach programs to ride-alongs with neighborhood leaders. As Elijah left the meeting, he passed Matthews in the hallway. The officer glared but said nothing. Elijah returned the look with steady resolve. Resistance was inevitable, but so was progress. And Elijah had no intention of backing down. The air in Rivermill Police Department felt different. While the resistance hadn't entirely faded, small signs of change began to take root. Officers who once laughed at crude jokes now hesitated. Conversations that had previously revolved around dismissing community concerns shifted, albeit cautiously, toward understanding them. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Elijah Carter spent his days methodically, reviewing cases, walking the precinct, and building relationships with his officers. He focused on fostering trust with those willing to embrace change, while continuing to hold the unrepentant accountable. One of those willing voices was Maria Reyes, who had transformed into a leader among the younger recruits. "Chief," she said one afternoon, knocking on his door, "I've been working with a few officers on a program idea. We want to start hosting community forums led by us, where residents can bring their concerns directly to officers." Elijah smiled. "That's a great idea, Officer Reyes, but remember, follow through is key. Don't just hear them, show them their voices matter." Maria nodded with determination. "We will." The first community-led forum took place in a local library. Officers Reyes and Jordan sat on the panel alongside other volunteers, their uniforms a striking contrast to the casual dress of the residents. The turnout was modest but meaningful. Mothers worried about their sons, shopkeepers angry about lack of patrols, teenagers hesitant but curious. The officers listened, sometimes uncomfortable, often surprised. One young man stood up toward the end, his voice trembling. "I've always thought you all were out to get us. But hearing you talk, maybe not all of you are bad." Maria's reply was calm but earnest. "We're working to be better, and we need your help to get there." Back at the precinct, not everyone embraced the momentum. Officer Matthews' appeal for reinstatement was officially denied following Elijah's review of his history. The news spread quickly, sending a clear message: misconduct was no longer tolerated. That evening, as Elijah locked up his office, he paused in the hallway, watching officers file out for their shifts. Their laughter sounded lighter, their conversations less guarded. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Elijah walked out into the cool night, the city's hum a steady backdrop. The seeds of renewal had been planted. Now it was time to nurture them. The morning sun bathed Rivermill in a warm golden glow as Elijah Carter stepped out of his truck in front of the precinct. It had been nearly a year since he'd taken on the role of chief of police, and though the road had been grueling, today felt different. Today, hope wasn't just a distant possibility. It was tangible. Inside, the precinct buzzed with activity, but this time, the energy was genuine. Officers greeted each other warmly, and even those once resistant to change had started to adapt. Elijah walked through the halls, observing the subtle but unmistakable shifts. Conversations had become more inclusive, laughter less cutting, and interactions with the public more empathetic. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Later that day, the department hosted its first annual Rivermill Unity Day, a community event aimed at bridging the gap between officers and the residents they served. Held in the city park, the event featured food stands, games, and open discussions. Families mingled with officers, children climbed into patrol cars, and laughter echoed through the air. Elijah stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. Maria Reyes approached, a bright smile on her face. "Chief, the turnout's incredible," she said. "We even have some of the kids from the youth center participating in the activities." "You and the team made this happen, Reyes," Elijah replied. "This is what it's about, connection." As they spoke, a boy approached hesitantly. Elijah recognized him from a previous meeting, a quiet child whose father had shared a story of police profiling. "Hi, Chief Carter," the boy said shyly. "I just wanted to say, thanks. My dad said you helped make things better." Elijah crouched down to his level, smiling. "Thank you for saying that. And remember, if you ever need anything, my door's always open." The boy nodded, his grin wide, before running back to join his friends. Elijah straightened, the moment a quiet affirmation of the work he and his team had done. As the sun set, casting a soft glow over Rivermill, Elijah returned to the precinct. The building stood as a symbol of both its troubled past and its brighter future. In his office, he sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey. Change was never easy. It was slow, painful, and met with resistance. But Rivermill was proof that change was possible, with perseverance, accountability, and a willingness to listen. That night, as Elijah locked the precinct doors behind him, he looked out over the quiet streets. The work was far from over, but for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. Rivermill wasn't just a city on the mend. It was a city on the rise. And Elijah Carter had every intention of leading it forward. The dawn of a new era had begun. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.